People always think revenge starts with anger, like a lightning strike or a scream that shatters glass. But mine didn't. Mine started quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon with a voicemail I almost deleted. I was 27 years old, sitting in my apartment in Portland, Oregon, folding laundry, and half watching the rain smear the city into gray watercolor through my window. Life was normal, peaceful even. I had a job I worked hard for, a car I paid for myself, and a silence in my life that I'd earned. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. I always do. But something, call it instinct, call it unfinished business, made me press play. Isabella, the voice said, hesitant, strained, older than I remembered. It's your mother. We need to talk. My hands froze around a damp t-shirt. Just like that, the air left the room. 12 years of distance collapsed into a single breath. I hadn't heard her voice since the night she chose him over me, since the night I was told I was dramatic, unstable, a problem that needed to be removed before I destroyed the family. I was 16 then, old enough to understand betrayal, young enough to think it would kill me. That night replayed itself in my head with cruel clarity. My stepfather standing in the doorway, arms crossed, smirk hidden behind fake concern. My mother sitting on the couch, eyes red but empty, letting him speak for her, letting him decide my fate. Pack a bag, he'd said. You can stay with a friend until you learn how to behave. No yelling, no tears, just quiet exile. I left with a duffel bag and a cracked phone, convinced I'd done something unforgivable. It took years to realize the truth. I was inconvenient, not guilty. Now here she was, my mother, calling from the past like nothing had happened, like I hadn't slept in my car, like I hadn't dropped out of school for a year just to survive, like I hadn't rebuilt myself from scraps of kindness borrowed from strangers. The voicemail ended with, "Please call me back. It's important. Important." That word tasted bitter. Everything had been important back then too, just never me. I didn't call her back. Not that day. I sat on the floor instead, surrounded by unfolded clothes, listening to the rain get heavier. I told myself I was done. I told myself I'd healed, and I had mostly, but healing doesn't erase memory. It just teaches you how to carry it without bleeding. And some wounds, the ones tied to blood and home, don't stay buried when called by name. That voicemail cracked something open, not rage, not sadness, clarity. Because here's the thing, no one tells you, revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like truth. Walking back into the room where you were erased, this time standing tall, this time unafraid, this time with nothing left to lose. And as I sat there, phone cold in my hand, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If my mother wanted to talk after 12 years of silence, it wasn't because she missed me. It was because something in her world was finally falling apart. And whether she realized it yet or not, I was no longer the girl she could throw away. I didn't return my mother's call until 3 days later, not because I needed time to decide, but because I needed time to remember who I was, not who I'd been when she last had power over me. By the time I pressed dial, I was calm in a way that scared me. The kind of calm that comes after you've already survived the worst thing someone could do to you. She answered on the second ring, breath hitching like she'd been holding it for days. "Isabella?" She said, hopeful, fragile. I let the silence stretch just long enough to remind her what it feels like to wait. "You called," I said, neutral, flat, not cruel controlled. There was a pause, then a rush of words. Apologies without specifics. Regret without accountability. I should have protected. I was confused. I didn't know what to do. Classic lines. I listened without interrupting, staring at the wall where sunlight cut a sharp line across peeling paint. When she finally stopped, I asked one question. "Why now?" She inhaled shakily. That was when the truth slipped out. My stepfather, Mark, had been arrested. White-collar fraud. Embezzlement from his own company. Millions missing. Federal charges. The kind of crime that looks invisible until it explodes. The kind of man who always preached discipline and respect while stealing behind closed doors. The same man who told everyone I was unstable, a liar, a bad influence. The same man my mother believed without hesitation. She said it all between sobs, like confession might buy absolution. They're investigating everything, she whispered. Finances, old records, family stuff, there it was. Fear. Not for me, but for herself. I felt something inside me settle, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. And you thought of me, I said. After 12 years, she didn't deny it. She wanted to meet, wanted to talk face to face, said she needed to explain. I agreed immediately, which surprised her. We set a date for the following Saturday at a cafe halfway between our cities. When the call ended, I sat very still. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I wasn't angry. That was the strangest part. I felt ready. Because revenge isn't always about hurting someone back. Sometimes it's about letting them see exactly who you became without them, and understanding they'll never get to be part of it. That week, memories surfaced like ghosts. Sleeping on a friend's couch senior year, working double shifts at a diner while finishing my GED, crying in a gas station bathroom at 2 a.m. because my bank balance read $14.27 every time. I'd wanted to call my mother and didn't. Every holiday spent pretending I didn't care. I remembered the moment. I realized no one was coming to save. Meant how that realization forced me to save myself. By 19, I was independent. By 23, I was stable. By 27, I was unbreakable. Not because life was easy, but because I stopped expecting fairness from people who'd already proven themselves incapable of it. Saturday came faster than I expected. I chose my outfit carefully, not to impress her, but to reflect me. Clean lines, confident posture, no armor, no apology. When I walked into the cafe, I saw her immediately. She looked smaller, older. The woman who once filled every room now sat hunched, fingers wrapped tightly around a mug she wasn't drinking from. When her eyes met mine, she stood too fast, chair scraping loudly. "Isabella," she said, voice cracking. I nodded once and sat down across from her. No hug, no warmth, just presence. She started crying almost immediately, talking about guilt, about manipulation, about how Mark had changed her. I let her talk, because people always reveal the most when they think they're explaining themselves, and with every word my certainty grew. She hadn't called to make things right. She'd called because the story she helped create was about to be questioned, and she needed me silent, or better yet, forgiving. She had no idea yet that I wasn't there to protect her. I was there to reclaim something she helped steal, my truth. She talked for nearly 20 minutes without stopping, like if she paused, the weight of everything she'd avoided for 12 years might finally crush her. I watched her the way you watch someone behind glass, close enough to see the details, far enough not to feel responsible. She told me how Mark had isolated her, how he'd handled everything, how she'd been afraid to go against him. She said she believed I was difficult, emotional, unstable, words he'd planted and watered until they grew into certainty. "He convinced me you were dangerous," she whispered, eyes glossy with tears. Dangerous. I almost laughed. 16-year-old me, terrified and obedient, afraid to take up space, dangerous only in the sense that I could see through him. I leaned back in my chair and finally spoke. "You didn't just believe him," I said calmly. "You participated." The words landed hard. She flinched like I'd slapped her for the first time since I'd arrived. She looked at mean, not the version she'd rewritten in her head, but the woman sitting across from her, independent, composed, unafraid. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I need your forgiveness." There it was. Not accountability, not repair. Forgiveness as if it were a bandage she could slap. on a gaping wound to make herself feel clean. I shook my head slowly. "You don't get to need things from me anymore," I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You forfeited that when you let someone else decide I was disposable." She started crying harder then, shoulders shaking, drawing glances from other customers. I felt nothing but distance. That emotional disconnect people warn you about? It wasn't numbness. It was clarity. I'd already mourned the mother I needed. This woman was just a stranger wearing her. She told me Mark had used my name during the investigation, said I was unstable. Estranged, proof that he'd always been the victim of difficult women. I felt my jaw tighten. So even now, he was using me as a shield. My mother reached across the table, hand hovering. I'm sure if she was allowed to touch me. I didn't stop her, but I didn't meet her halfway either. "They might contact you," she said quietly. "Investigators, lawyers, I wanted you to hear it from me first." There it was, the real reason for the call. I looked her straight in the eyes. "If they contact me," I said, "I'll tell the truth." Her breath caught. "Everything," I added. She pulled her hand back like she'd touched fire. "Isabella," I stood up, cutting her off. Not dramatically, just decisively. "You don't get to manage this," I said. "You don't get to control the narrative anymore. You already did that once, and it almost destroyed me." I picked up my coat, slung my bag over my shoulder. She looked up at me like a child who'd realized too late that an apology doesn't rewind time. "I didn't come here to punish you," I said. "I came here to release myself." Then I paused just long enough to let the truth sink in. "Whatever happens next, that's on you." As I walked out of the cafe, the air felt sharper, cleaner, like rain before a storm breaks. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded, because the revenge I was building wasn't loud or violent or impulsive. It was patient, it was honest, and it was going to unfold simply by refusing to lie anymore for anyone. The next morning, I woke with the sunlight slanting through my apartment, blinds and a sense of focus I hadn't felt in years. Revenge, I realized, isn't always about confrontation. It's about living your life so fully, so unapologetically that those who wronged you are powerless to influence it. I had a plan, not a scheme, but a methodical way to reclaim what had been stolen: my reputation, my dignity, my independence. First, I needed records. Everything my mother and Mark had tried to manipulate over the years: financial statements, emails, old texts, employment history, school records. I was going to verify them. No emotion, no second guessing. I had learned that emotions were the tool people used to trap you. The trick was detachment, and I had it in abundance now. One spent the morning making calls to old teachers, contacting my former guidance counselor, even digging up old pay stubs from the summer I worked at the diner. Each document, each verification, was like putting a puzzle together, one that painted a picture of me as I actually was, not the distorted version they broadcast. I discovered mistakes they had made, lies they had told, and patterns of manipulation that had gone unchecked for years. It was infuriating, yes, but there was also a thrill to it. I felt in control for the first time since I'd been 15. Standing in a storm, shivering, with nothing but a backpack and my own resilience. The power that had been taken from me would not be quietly reclaimed. It would be methodically documented, undeniable, and undeniable is what revenge is built on in the modern world. By the afternoon, I was ready for step 2, exposing the truth to the people who mattered. I wrote emails to family friends who had always believed the narrative my mother and Mark had spun, carefully laying out facts, dates, and verifiable evidence. No hyperbole, no accusation-laden language, just cold, unassailable facts. I also contacted my college advisor, who had always championed me, letting them know the story that had almost derailed my education. Watching them respond with shock, disbelief, and then support, I felt an unexpected satisfaction, the kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from rage, but from precision and integrity. People who had once doubted me now had no choice but to see me as I truly was: capable, honest, and resilient. Later that evening, I drafted a private journal entry outlining everything I wanted to say to my mother. Everything I would never say aloud because saying it would only empower her. Again, I wrote about the nights I spent hiding my tears, the days I worked extra shifts to pay for necessities, the quiet humiliation of realizing that the people who should have loved me unconditionally had chosen lies over me. I wrote about how their negligence shaped me into someone who refused to be powerless ever again. But I also wrote about how that power wasn't for revenge in the way they imagined. It wasn't about making them suffer. It was about reclaiming my life on my own terms, showing them that every attempt to control me had failed. The sun was setting by the time I stepped onto my balcony, overlooking the city skyline. I sipped a lukewarm cup of tea, savoring the calm that comes with clarity. This was my city now, my life, my story. And in that moment, I realized the ultimate revenge: living well, fully unapologetically. They had tried to write me out of the story to define who I was, but I had become the author of my own narrative. Step by step, fact by fact, I was undoing the lies and manipulation, not through confrontation alone, but through the undeniable truth of my life. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And that, more than anything, would be the hardest thing for them to ever accept. The next morning, I woke up to the buzzing of my phone notifications from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Strangers turned to lies who had heard about my story through mutual connections. Some messages were hesitant, apologetic, unsure if they should reach out. Others were brimming with support, admiration, and an eagerness to help me reclaim my life. I smiled at the irony. For years, I had been silenced, erased, and misrepresented, and now, with nothing more than the truth and a little persistence, I was being amplified. I realized that revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, measured, and unstoppable. I spent the morning organizing everything into folders, both digital and physical. Emails, bank statements, receipts, old texts, school transcripts all lined up like soldiers ready for battle. Each one told the truth about who I was, and each one highlighted the lies they had woven so carefully. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to prove my innocence in someone else's story. I was creating a record that no one could dispute. By midday, I was drafting a plan for confronting Mark, not the shouting, angry confrontation that might have occurred when I was younger, but a structured, undeniable presentation of the facts. I wanted to sit him down and watch as the world he had built on manipulation crumbled piece by piece. I listed every lie, every act of coercion, every attempt to erase me. The moment I realized the full scope of his influence over my life was infuriating and liberating all at once. I could feel the adrenaline, but it wasn't reckless. It was purpose. I would confront him not to indulge in anger, but to reclaim authority over my own life. I wasn't a scared 16-year-old anymore. I was Isabella, 28, fully aware of my power and fully prepared to wield it with precision. Later, I reached out to my best friend from college, Ava, who had always been my unofficial sounding board for everything life threw at me. I walked her through the plan, the timeline, and the evidence. She listened, occasionally interjecting with practical advice, sometimes shaking her head in disbelief at the audacity and cruelty I had endured. "You're a legend," she said finally. "Seriously, they think they can write your story, but you're rewriting it in bold letters." I laughed at her phrasing, but she was right. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming every year they had stolen from me and ensuring that no one could ever question who I was again. The goal wasn't to humiliate them publicly, though that was a side effect. It was to create an unshakable foundation for my life, one built entirely on truth. By evening, I was ready for step 2, assembling witnesses and allies who could corroborate every detail. Teachers, neighbors, old coworkers, anyone who had ever seen the discrepancies, the lies, or the manipulation firsthand. I called, emailed, and messaged until my phone was a symphony of alerts. I realized, with a bittersweet thrill, that the people who had once believed the false narrative were now being shown the truth in a way they couldn't ignore. This wasn't revenge through anger or retaliation. It was revenge through undeniable reality. And the satisfaction was intoxicating. Each confirmation, each corroboration was a building block, slowly constructing a fortress around me, impervious to the manipulations of the past. By nightfall, I sat back in my apartment, exhausted but exhilarated. I stared out at the city lights, reflecting on the distance I had traveled both physically and emotionally from that powerless girl in the storm to this calculated, assertive woman. Revenge wasn't just a goal. It was a process, a series of intentional steps, and I had finally embraced it fully. I realized that the ultimate victory wouldn't come from there, humiliation or punishment. It would come from my own freedom, my own validation, and the life I was now claiming as my own. That night, I slept knowing that every move I made, every call I placed, every document I verified, was part of a larger story, one where I finally held the pen. The following week, I took the first step toward confronting Mark directly. I didn't call him, didn't text him, and I certainly didn't go to his apartment unannounced. Instead, I prepared a formal package, carefully organized, meticulously labeled, and impossible to dismiss. In it were copies of all the evidence I had gathered: emails, receipts, bank statements, photographs, old texts, and affidavits from witnesses who remembered the manipulations, the lies, and the subtle psychological warfare he and my mother had waged against me for years. Every single document was dated, verifiable, and constructed to tell the story in a way that left no room for excuses or reinterpretation. I included a letter, but this one wasn't pleading, apologetic, or emotional. It was crisp, firm, and factual, a detailed account of the years I had been undermined, manipulated, and erased. I mailed it to his address with certified delivery, so there would be proof he received it. There was a thrill in the precision, a satisfaction that came from knowing this wasn't reactive. It was deliberate, strategic, and under my complete control. For days after, I watched the tracking information like a hawk. The package moved slowly across the city, and every time I saw an update, I felt a surge of quiet triumph. It was absurd, I know, to find satisfaction in a piece of paper traveling through the postal system, but the symbolism wasn't lost on me. This was my life moving forward, a tangible demonstration that the powerless girl I once was could now orchestrate the outcome of her own story. I spent the evenings preparing for the next steps. How I would respond if he denied everything, how I would protect myself legally, and how I would maintain my own integrity without giving him any leverage. The control I had now was exhilarating, and I relished it. For the first time in over a decade, I felt untouchable, not invincible, but untouchable in the way that comes from knowing the truth and having the evidence to back it up. Then, 2 days after delivery, the response arrived. It wasn't what I expected. The letter was thin, the handwriting shaky, and the tone cautious. He claimed he had no memory of many incidents, didn't realize the extent of what had happened, and hoped to reconcile at some point. The words were empty, a faint attempt to soothe his conscience without acknowledging the truth. But I wasn't there for an apology, at least not from him. I was there to reclaim what was mine, my life, my reputation, my peace. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in my evidence binder. It was now part of the official record, a clear example of the same evasion, denial, and manipulation that had defined my entire upbringing. I didn't feel anger this time. Instead, I felt relief. I wasn't waiting for him to admit his failures. I was taking them out of the shadows, exposing them in a way that he couldn't rewrite, hide, or justify. The following days were about strategy. I contacted a family law attorney, not for custody or guardianship this time, but for advice on protecting myself, my assets, and ensuring that any lingering legal issues from my past couldn't be used against me. The attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel, confirmed my suspicions. The evidence I had collected was airtight, and even a casual review would expose the full pattern of manipulation and theft. That validation, practical and unemotional, felt like a victory in itself. It meant I was no longer at the mercy of their lies, no longer bound to prove myself to anyone but the law, the truth, and myself. By the end of the week, I realized the most important lesson. I had learned in all this: revenge isn't about public humiliation, isn't about screaming at the person who wronged you. It's about living so fully, so authentically, and so unapologetically that they can't touch you anymore. I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. I was Isabella, survivor, strategist, and author of my own story. And the next move? That would be mine entirely. The next morning, I decided it was time to take the confrontation into the real world, but on my terms. I wasn't going to ambush Mark, yell at him, or seek any sort of immediate emotional gratification. Instead, I chose a neutral location, a small cafe halfway between his apartment and mine. I picked a spot where I could control the environment, bright, public, no distractions, and, importantly, a place where I felt safe. I arrived early, dressed sharply but comfortably, my binder of evidence tucked neatly under the table. I sipped my coffee, organized my notes, rehearsed my words. Every detail mattered: tone, pace, body language, and the sequence in which the facts would be revealed. I had spent years internalizing fear, doubt, and confusion, but now every move I made was deliberate. I wasn't the scared teenager anymore. I was Isabella, fully aware of the power I had reclaimed, and I wasn't there to beg for validation or forgiveness. I was there to assert reality. When Mark walked in, I noticed immediately how different he looked from the man who had haunted my memories. He was older, slower, his posture slumped, the arrogance gone. He tried a half smile, the kind of smile that used to make me flinch. I didn't flinch anymore. I held my gaze steady, cool, and measured. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. He hesitated, scanning the cafe like he was looking for escape routes. But the reality was inescapable. He couldn't walk away from the story I was about to tell, and I knew it. I opened the binder slowly, deliberately, and placed it in front of him. Every page a silent accusation, every document a testament to years of careful observation, documentation, and unwavering persistence. The binder wasn't just evidence, it was a declaration I existed. I had survived. I was real, and everything he thought he could deny was now irrefutable. I started with small facts, neutral but verifiable: bank withdrawals, school attendance records, pharmacy receipts, witness statements. I watched his face as each piece of information settled over him. At first, there was disbelief, a subtle twitch of denial. Then frustration. His lips pressed together, a small vein throbbed in his temple. The charm and manipulation that had worked for so long were useless now. I could see the panic rising. Not the panic of fear. He wasn't afraid of me, but the panic of exposure. The years of control he had wielded over my life were crumbling in front of him, and he couldn't do a thing to stop it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I spoke calmly, clearly, with precise pacing, ensuring that each revelation landed like a hammer blow. I could almost hear the narrative he had built in his head cracking, splintering under the weight of truth. Midway through, Mark tried to interrupt, tried to explain, tried to justify. I didn't allow it. "Not yet," I said firmly. "You get to respond when I'm finished. Right now, you listen." His eyes widened, but I didn't waver. There was a long moment of silence as I laid out the final pieces: the burner phone, the delayed theft reports, the forged checks, and finally, the statements from everyone who had witnessed Karen's and his collusion over the years. Each page flipped brought him closer to reality, closer to the undeniable conclusion that the world he had tried to manipulate wasn't under his control anymore. By the time I closed the binder, he looked defeated. Not angry, not rebellious, just quiet, diminished, and utterly incapable of regaining any semblance of the power he once wielded over me. I leaned back, took a sip of coffee, and let the silence speak for itself. The victory wasn't loud or vengeful, it was absolute. I had survived, documented, and confronted the architect of my suffering with facts, composure, and a power he could no longer touch. And in that silence, I realized the ultimate revenge was not destruction, but liberation. After that cafe meeting, I realized that the real power didn't come from watching Mark squirm or seeing him acknowledge the truth it came from reclaiming my own narrative and fully stepping into the life I had fought so hard to build. Over the following weeks, I devoted myself entirely to the parts of my life that had been denied for so long. My career, my friends, my apartment, and most importantly, my sense of self-worth. Every morning I woke up and reminded myself that I had survived betrayal, manipulation, and abandonment, and that I was no longer bound by the expectations or false narratives of my past. I organized my workspace at the marketing firm with precision, started keeping a personal journal where I could track accomplishments and goals, and even began a side project writing essays and personal reflections about resilience and the psychology of manipulation. These pieces weren't just therapeutic. They were proof that the girl who had once walked alone in a storm could now control every facet of her destiny, from professional success to emotional stability. Each email I sent, each project I completed, and each meeting I led became a small act of reclamation, a public declaration that I existed, and I thrived, despite everything. I also strengthened my personal relationships in ways I had never allowed myself to before. Colin became not just a partner, but a witness to my reclamation. We talked openly about boundaries, past traumas, and future goals. I introduced him to my grandmother, who continued to be the anchor I had always needed, and together, we established traditions and routines that reminded me every day that family could be a source of love rather than fear. I reconnected with old friends who had drifted away when the chaos of my adolescence became too heavy to navigate, explaining honestly, calmly, and without judgment what had happened. The support I received in return wasn't performative or conditional. It was genuine, reinforcing the lesson I had learned painfully over years, that the world could be cruel, but there were people who could be trusted and who could help me grow. Meanwhile, Mark's attempts to contact me after the cafe meeting were half-hearted and quickly abandoned. I never returned his calls or emails, any words he tried to string together to seek reconciliation or absolution fell flat because I had realized that forgiveness didn't require interaction, confrontation, or approval. Forgiveness, I understood, was internal. It was the act of releasing the weight of someone else's mistakes from your own chest, and I had already carried that weight for far too long. I didn't need his apology anymore. I had created my own version of closure, and it was far more powerful than anything he could offer. I also formalized legal protections to ensure he could never manipulate me or my assets again. With Rachel's guidance, we implemented a series of restraining orders, financial safeguards, and documentation protocols. Each legal document became another layer of armor, a visible boundary between the life I had fought to build and the chaos of my past. Every interaction with him was mediated through law and documentation, transforming fear into structure and vulnerability into strength. For the first time, I felt completely safe in my autonomy. And yet, I knew my journey wasn't just about defense or revenge, it was about creation. I started exploring passions I had shelved for years, joining photography clubs, attending workshops, and volunteering at youth centers to mentor girls facing manipulation and abuse. Each photograph, each project, each story I helped shape in someone else's life became a declaration that Isabella, the survivor, was more than her trauma. She was a creator, a leader, and a woman fully capable of defining her own identity. The final chapter of that dark period didn't come with a dramatic courtroom scene or a televised confrontation. It came quietly, in the normal rhythms of life, where survival had transformed into thriving. I moved my grandmother's old filing cabinet into my apartment, a symbol of the meticulous care and preparedness that had saved me, and filled it with receipts, contracts, journals, and letters, a personal archive of resilience. On weekends, I'd wander the city's streets, camera in hand, capturing moments that reminded me of life's fleeting beauty, a mother laughing with her child on the Boston Common, sunlight glinting off the Charles River, or the golden leaves tumbling down Newbury Street in October. These small observations grounded me, reminding me that the storm I had walked through years ago was not the sum total of my existence. It was a single, defining moment in a life that I now controlled. I finished my graduate program while working full-time. Each late-night essay and early morning client call a testament to the discipline and focus I had cultivated from surviving chaos. Every achievement became its own quiet act of revenge, not against Mark or Karen, but against the narrative they had tried to write for me. I wasn't bitter. I was unstoppable. By the following summer, I was engaged to Colin, the man who had never judged my past and whose patience and kindness offered a love I had never known at 15. We planned a small wedding at a historic Boston loft, complete with string lights, close friends, and a playlist that felt like us. I gave my grandmother the honor of walking me down the aisle, a tribute to the woman who had been my anchor, my protector, and my champion. I wore a simple white dress, my hair loosely braided, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed permission to be happy. I was Isabella, the girl who had been cast out into a storm, who had fought tooth and nail to reclaim her identity, and who was finally allowed to step fully into her own life. My vows to Colin were grounded in honesty, trust, and gratitude, not only for him, but for the life I had built from nothing. And in the quiet moments, when I looked into his eyes, I could feel the weight of the past dissolve, replaced by the warmth of a life chosen deliberately, thoughtfully, and fully. Mark eventually passed away quietly in his nursing home, leaving behind a legacy of regret that he could never undo. Karen's life continued, but with limits imposed by the law and by the consequences of her actions, restrictions that ensured she could never threaten me again. I didn't feel joy in their punishment, only relief. Their power over me had ended years ago, and now I only had to focus on the life I wanted to create. I built friendships rooted in trust, pursued a career that challenged and fulfilled me, and created a home where I could be entirely myself. Each decision I made was a statement. My past did not define me. My present was mine to craft. Looking back on the storm, I realized it was never about vengeance. The real victory was autonomy, clarity, and resilience. I survived, yes, but I also thrived. I am Isabella, the girl who refused to be erased, who refused to accept a false story about herself, and who built a life worth living on her own terms. Every rainstorm now reminds me not of betrayal or fear, but of survival, courage, and the power of reclaiming your story. That October night may have cast shadows, but it also lit the spark that would guide me through the years, until I finally reached the sunlight on my own.